Today, we're going to explore the dark corridors and spooky basements of 7 horror stories involving haunted houses. Get ready to hear chilling tales of dwellings that hold sinister secrets, restless spirits, and unexplained events. We'll delve into urban legends and terrifying experiences that will make you think twice before entering an abandoned house. So settle in, make sure all the doors are securely closed, and let's begin this chilling journey. Oh, and before some mischievous spirit decides to turn off his cell phone, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like. 1. The House of Mirrors. In a remote part of England, in the village of Blackwood, the Carter family found what seemed to be the house of their dreams. The Blackthorn Mansion, built in the 19th century, was an imposing property, with tall windows and a Gothic facade that seemed straight out of a Victorian novel. Sarah and Michael Carter were excited to start over there with their 2 children, Emily, 12, and Ben, 8. The price of the mansion was surprisingly affordable, and the realtor mentioned only in passing that the house had a peculiar history. From day one, Emily was fascinated by the mirrors scattered around the house. There was one in almost every room, tall mirrors with ornate frames, small round mirrors in narrow hallways, and even a large full-length mirror in the master bedroom. "It's like the house has eyes," joked Michael as he helped Sarah unpack the boxes. On the first night, while exploring her new room, Emily noticed something strange. As she passed the antique mirror next to her bed, she felt as if her reflection had taken an extra second to imitate her. She blinked and shook her head, convincing herself that it was just tiredness from the move. Over the next few days, more disturbing things began to happen. Sarah noticed that the mirrors always seemed to be slightly fogged up, even when clean. Ben began to avoid looking at them, saying that the people in the glass made him uncomfortable. Michael dismissed the complaints as childish imagination and suggested that everyone needed to adjust to the new house. On the third night, Sarah woke up in the middle of the night to hear light footsteps in the hallway. Thinking it was one of the children, she got up to check. As she passed the hall mirror, she stopped abruptly. For a brief moment, she was sure that her reflection was not exactly aligned with her movements. She felt a shiver run up her spine and hurried back to her room. Things got worse when Emily disappeared. The morning after her disappearance, Sarah found her daughter's room empty and the window open. The police were called immediately and began searching the woods around the property, but found no sign of the girl. Desperate for answers, Sarah began searching the house for clues. It was then that she found a diary, hidden behind a drawer in the upstairs office. The diary belonged to the former owner of the mansion, Evelyn Blackthorn, a reclusive woman known for her obsession with the occult. The pages of the diary revealed something terrifying. Evelyn believed that the mirrors were portals to another dimension, a dark place inhabited by distorted versions of people from the real world. She wrote about experiments carried out in the house to try to control the reflections and use them as obedient servants, but something went wrong. The reflexes started acting on their own and tried to escape into the real world. Sarah showed Michael the diary, but he refused to believe the absurd story. "It's just some crazy old woman writing nonsense," he said as he closed the book tightly. That night, while Michael slept soundly, Sarah decided to investigate the mirrors in the house further. Armed with a flashlight and Evelyn's diary, she went down to the basement where there was a large mirror covered with a white sheet. When she removed the sheet, she saw something that made her heart stop. Emily was on the other side of the glass. Her daughter looked frightened and was desperately banging on the glass as if she were trapped inside it. "Emily!" cried Sarah as she tried to touch the cold glass. Before she could do anything, a hand came out of the mirror. But it wasn't Emily's. It was something pale and distorted. It was something pale and distorted, with fingers too long to be human. Sarah stepped back as a figure identical to her slowly emerged from the mirror. The Sarah, on the other side, smiled sinisterly before whispering, "Trade with me." Sarah ran up the stairs in a panic and locked herself in the master bedroom with Michael. When she tried to explain what she had seen, he finally started to believe her, especially when they noticed that all the mirrors in the room were starting to fog up. From the inside, the two decided to destroy all the mirrors in the house that very night. Armed with hammers and makeshift tools, they started on the first floor. Each time they smashed a mirror, they heard muffled screams coming from the shattered glass. But when they reached the basement again to destroy the large mirror where Emily was trapped, they realized that it had changed. It now showed the whole family reflected, except Ben. "Ben!" shouted Michael as they ran to his son's room. They found Ben standing in front of the upstairs hallway mirror, his hand outstretched as if he was about to touch it. Before they could reach him, he was pulled into the glass by something invisible. Desperate to save her sons, Sarah remembered the last pages of Evelyn's diary. There was a way to close the portals for good, but it required a sacrifice. Michael insisted on being the one to go through the large mirror in the basement to bring the children back, while Sarah finished the ritual described in the diary. He knew he might not return, but he couldn't leave his children trapped in that dark place. Michael stepped into the mirror without hesitation as Sarah recited the ancient words written in the diary. The glass began to glow brightly before cracking completely, freeing Emily and Ben at the last second. But Michael never came back. Today, years after the events at Blackthorn Manor, Sarah lives with her children in another town, far away from any ancient mirror or dark legend. But sometimes, at night, she swears she hears soft knocks coming from the other side of the windows of her new home. 2. The Forbidden Cellar. In the quiet town of Millbrook, in the English countryside, Mark and Sophie Thompson have finally found the house of their dreams. The Victorian property, with its red brick walls and arched windows, seemed perfect for the young couple looking to escape the hustle and bustle of London. The price was surprisingly affordable, but there was one peculiar condition. The basement had to remain locked and never be opened. The estate agent, an elderly man with a nervous look on his face, insisted that this clause be included in the contract. "It's just a formality," he said, avoiding eye contact. The house has history, and the previous owners prefer to keep certain areas untouched. Intrigued, but not discouraged, Mark and Sophie agreed. After all, what could be so terrible about an old basement? The first few weeks in the new house were idyllic. The couple enjoyed the tranquility of the countryside and the charming architecture of the residence. However, as they settled in, they began to notice strange things. Muffled sounds came from the walls at night, as if something was moving inside them. The air on the first floor was always cold, no matter how much they heated the house. Sophie began to have recurring nightmares about a locked door and whispering voices calling her from the other side. Mark, for his part, felt constantly watched when he was alone in the house. His curiosity about the basement grew every day. The couple tried to ignore the locked door at the end of the corridor, but it was as if it was silently calling them. One stormy night, after a few glasses of wine, the temptation became irresistible. "Let's just have a look," said Mark, holding up a crowbar. Nobody needs to know. With their hearts racing, they opened the door. The smell of mold and decay hit them immediately. A steep staircase led down into the darkness. Mark turned on the flashlight on his cell phone and started down, with Sophie right behind. The basement was a large, damp space, with stone walls covered in strange symbols. In the center, there was a circle drawn on the floor with what looked like dried blood. Inside the circle, an old wooden box lay sealed with iron chains. "We shouldn't be here," Sophie whispered, feeling a growing sense of dread. Before they could decide to go back, they heard a click. The basement door had closed on its own. Panic seized them as they ran back to the stairs, only to find that the door wouldn't open. A low, guttural sound began to emanate from the box in the center of the basement. The chains that sealed it began to move on their own, slowly unwinding. Mark and Sophie watched in horror as the lid of the box opened. A thick black mist began to spread through the air, forming a humanoid figure with glowing red eyes. "Free, free at last," a hoarse, ancient voice echoed through the basement. The entity turned to the terrified couple. "You have freed us. Now, you will be our new vessels." Mark and Sophie tried desperately to escape, but the mist quickly enveloped them. They felt as if their souls were being ripped from their bodies, replaced by something cold and ancient. When the basement door finally opened, it was no longer Mark and Sophie who had come up the stairs. Their bodies moved strangely, like puppets controlled by invisible hands. Their eyes, once full of life, were now empty and dark. Over the next few days, the neighbors noticed changes in the couple's behavior. They rarely left the house, and when they did, there was something wrong with their movements and expressions. Children and animals instinctively ran away from them. At night, strange lights could be seen through the windows of the house, and inhuman sounds echoed through the property. More and more people in the town began to have terrible nightmares, always involving an evil presence calling out to them. Weeks later, other houses in the neighborhood began to show signs of supernatural activity. It was as if the curse was spreading, infecting the whole town. The real estate agent, upon learning that the basement had been opened, disappeared without a trace. They found an old diary in his house that revealed the truth. The entity in the basement was an ancient demon, imprisoned centuries ago by a group of occultists. The house had been built as a prison, and each generation of owners was charged with keeping the secret. Now, free from its prison, the entity used Mark and Sophie as avatars to spread its evil influence. The small town of Millbrook was doomed, and no one knew how to stop the evil that had been unleashed. Authorities were called in to investigate the strange events, but those who entered the house were never seen again. The property was sealed off, but it was too late. The supernatural infection had already spread beyond control. Today, Millbrook is a ghost town. No one dares go near it, and horror stories circulate about the terrible fates of those who dare to enter its boundaries. And at the center of it all, the Victorian house remains standing, its dark windows like empty eyes watching the outside world, waiting for more unwary souls to feed the insatiable hunger of the entity that now inhabits it. The basement, once locked and forgotten, is now always open, and from its depths, echoes of demonic laughter can be heard, reminding everyone of the terrible price of human curiosity and the power of ancient curses that should remain buried forever. 3. The House That Cries Blood. The village of Black Hollow in Scotland was known for its thick fog, and the sepulchral silence that dominated the streets after sunset. It wasn't an inviting place for tourists, and the locals seemed to relish the solitude. However, there was one house on the edge of the village that no one dared approach: Holloway Manor. For decades, it had stood abandoned, its windows broken, and its roof tilted as if the structure itself was trying to escape from what dwelled inside. One stormy night, something strange happened. The winds howled through the hills, and the rain punished the land mercilessly. In the morning, when the storm finally subsided, the residents noticed something impossible. The walls of the mansion were covered in a thick, red liquid, oozing out slowly as if the house itself were bleeding. The metallic smell of blood permeated the air, and those who dared to get close swore they could hear murmurs coming from inside. John Millison, a young local journalist, decided to investigate. He had always thought the village legends were exaggerated, but the sight of that substance seeping through the rotting wood aroused his uncontrollable curiosity. Armed with a flashlight and a camera, John pushed open the door of the house, which swung open with an agonizing creak. The interior was stifling. The smell of mold, mixed with the iron of blood, permeated the air. The floor was damp, as if the house was sweating in fear. He began to explore the rooms, taking note of every detail. The walls seemed alive, pulsating, with blood seeping through the cracks. Then he found something disturbing. Old photographs scattered across the floor, all depicting the same family: a man, a woman, and 2 children. The faces, however, were crossed out, as if someone wanted to erase them from history. On the back of one of the photos, John read something scribbled in a hurry: "They never left." In the dusty library, he found old records of the village, and then the truth came out. In 1897, the Holloway family was brutally murdered inside that house. It was said that the patriarch, Thomas Holloway, in a fit of madness, took a knife and took the lives of his wife and children before hanging himself in the attic. The bodies were found weeks later, already decomposing, and since then, no one has dared to live there again. A bang came from upstairs. John was startled. He was alone, or at least he should have been. Heart racing, he pointed the flashlight at the dust-covered staircase. He climbed slowly, feeling each step creak under his feet. At the end of the corridor, an ajar door swayed in the wind. When he pushed it open, he found a dark, damp attic, and in the center of the room, a chair rocking on its own. Then a gurgling sound filled the space. John turned the flashlight and saw something impossible: a tall, distorted shadow rising in the corner. Its eyes were empty, and its mouth an open slit from which blood seemed to flow incessantly. The creature stretched out its hand, and at that instant, John felt a sharp chill run through him. He wanted to run, but his body wouldn't do it. Whispers echoed in his mind, indistinct voices calling out for justice. The attic door slammed shut. The blood that had once dripped down the walls now seemed to move towards him, forming spiral patterns on the floor. Something was happening, something ancient and impatient. John tried to scream, but his voice failed him. His body became heavy, his vision darkened. The next morning, the residents of Black Hollow found the mansion once again silent. The blood was gone. The metallic smell was gone. But John Millison was never seen again. His car was still parked in the driveway. His footprints were still fresh in the mud, but inside the house, there was no sign of him. Only his flashlight lying in the attic, covered in a thick red liquid. Over the next few days, rumors began to circulate among the villagers. Some claimed that if you stood quietly outside the house at midnight, you could hear John's voice whispering for help. Others said that his shadow had been seen wandering the corridors, as if he were eternally trapped in the Holloway mansion. Weeks later, a new macabre detail emerged. A group of unsuspecting young people decided to enter the house to prove that it was all just superstition. Only one of them returned. He was found wandering the streets of Black Hollow, barefoot, covered in scratches, and muttering non-stop. The house needs more. It always needs more. The village decided to seal the mansion's doors and windows with rusty boards and chains. But even so, the place continued to pulsate like a living organism. And whenever the storm came, the blood returned, flowing down the walls like tears, whispering the names of those who dared to cross its path. The house had chosen a new secret to keep. What's up, guys? Are you enjoying the stories so far? If so, how about taking a quick break to support the channel? Just click on the subscribe button and leave your like. It really helps my work and motivates me to keep bringing you more scary content like this. It only takes a few seconds and it makes all the difference. Now let's get back to our haunted house stories, shall we? There's still a lot of terrifying stuff ahead. Room 423-7. The Grand Hollow Hotel, located in the icy mountains of Colorado, was a monument to the luxury of the past. Built at the end of the 19th century, it still displayed its imposing architecture and Victorian furniture, but it hid a dark secret. All the staff knew. Room 237 was never to be occupied. The few who tried to spend a night there left traumatized, never talking about what they had witnessed. Legend had it that decades ago, a woman called Eleanor Hawthorne was found dead in that room, her body deformed by the horror on her face. Since then, doors have slammed on their own, screams have been heard through the walls, and guests have reported feeling a presence watching them from the dark. Some staff swore they heard whispers coming from the room even when it was empty, and a chambermaid disappeared without a trace after entering to clean the place. Robert Claiborne, a writer and avowed skeptic, decided to stay at Grand Hollow to investigate the mystery. He didn't believe in ghosts and wanted to prove that all the rumors were just superstition. With his camera, voice recorder, and a diary, he settled into room 237, determined to document everything. The first hour was uneventful. He recorded a video mocking the legend and even provoked Eleanor's spirit, challenging it to give a sign of its presence. Nothing happened. Satisfied, he settled into his armchair and began to write his notes. But at 2:37 in the morning, everything changed. The lamp next to his bed flickered 3 times before going out completely. The air in the room turned icy, and the smell of rotting flowers took over. Robert picked up his flashlight and began to explore. When he pointed it at the mirror, his own reflection looked wrong. His face was distorted, his mouth open in a silent scream. But he wasn't screaming. A dry noise came from the bathroom. The door was ajar, swinging slowly. He walked over hesitantly, and, as he pushed it fully open, he saw something that made his heart stop. The bathtub was full of dark water, and, inside it, a motionless female figure. Her long, wet hair covered her face, and her pale hands gripped the edges of the tub, as if trying to get out. Robert stepped back, panting. Suddenly, the woman moved. Slowly, her head turned towards him, revealing completely black eyes and a mouth deformed into an impossible smile. She whispered something unintelligible and in one violent movement got out of the bath, advancing towards him. Desperate, Robert stumbled backwards, but the bedroom door slammed shut on its own. He knocked hard, trying to open it. But it was no use. Behind him, a presence approached. He felt icy fingers touch the back of his neck, and an icy whisper fill his ears. "Stay with me. Forever." The room was plunged into an oppressive darkness. Robert felt a weight on his chest, as if invisible hands were pressing his body to the floor. His heart hammered in despair when he heard the sound of water running. The putrid smell intensified, and then he saw it. A dark stain was spreading across the carpet, forming sinuous patterns that seemed to move on their own. The sound of wet footsteps echoed through the room, and Eleanor began to whisper in her dead tongue words that seemed to resonate inside Robert's own mind. His eyes began to water, his vision blurred. He tried to scream, but his voice was silenced. In the mirror opposite the bed, he saw something that terrified him. His own reflection began to change. His face elongated, his skin paled, his eyes became as dark as Eleanor's. It was as if he was becoming part of that person. It was as if he was becoming part of that place, an extension of the entity that resided there. The last thing Robert saw was the woman crawling across the floor, her arms stretching grotesquely as her blackened nails scratched the floorboards. Then everything went black. The next morning, the hotel's staff found the room empty. The bed was intact, as if no one had slept there. Only Robert's diary remained on the table. With his last note scribbled in frantic handwriting, "She's here. I can't get out. Please, someone help me." No one ever saw Robert Claiborne again. Room 237 has been permanently locked, but some say that on the coldest nights they can still hear the echo of his screams within the walls of the Grand Hollow Hotel. And sometimes, when a new guest passes through the deserted corridor on the second floor, they can swear they see a man standing in front of the door to room 237. His face is pale, his eyes empty, and if you stare long enough, he may stare back. Some witnesses claim that on stormy nights, dim lights flash behind the door of room 237, as if someone is walking around inside. A hotel security guard, passing through the corridor in the early hours of the morning, reported hearing the door creak open, just enough to reveal a shadow standing in the dark, watching him. He never returned to the hotel. In 1998, a documentary crew attempted to record a special on the mysteries of Grand Hollow. When they reviewed the footage taken on the second floor, they realized that all the cameras captured the same figure in the mirrors along the corridor. A tall man in a dark suit with no face. And in each scene, he seemed to be a little closer to the camera. 5. The Whispering Mansion. In the isolated highlands of Scotland, writer Emily Blackwood rented the old Ravencroft Manor to finish her thriller novel. The 19th-century Gothic property, shrouded in mist and mystery, seemed the perfect place for inspiration. The estate agent, a nervous-looking man, hesitated before handing over the keys. "The house has history," he murmured. "Some say it speaks to its occupants." Emily laughed, thinking it was just an attempt to create atmosphere. After all, she was a horror writer. Stories of haunted houses didn't scare her. For the first few days, Emily was enchanted by the mansion's gloomy atmosphere. The dark corridors, faded tapestries, and old portraits created the perfect setting for her story. She spent hours exploring the dusty rooms, imagining the secrets the walls could tell. At night, while working on her manuscript, Emily began to hear distant whispers echoing through the corridors. At first, she attributed them to the wind or her fertile imagination. But as the days went by, the voices became clearer and more insistent. "Help us," they begged. "Find out the truth." Emily tried to ignore the sounds, focusing on her work, but the voices haunted her, even in her dreams. She began to see visions of a young woman in Victorian clothes, crying in a dark corner of the mansion. Determined to keep her sanity, Emily researched the history of the estate. She discovered that the mansion had belonged to the Ravencroft family in the 19th century. The youngest daughter, Elizabeth, had mysteriously disappeared at the age of 18. Her body was never found, and rumors of murder haunted the family for generations. The voices intensified, prompting Emily to scour the mansion for clues. On a particularly cold night, she discovered a diary hidden behind a loose panel in the library. The yellowed pages revealed a sinister plot involving occult rituals and human sacrifices. The diary belonged to Lord Ravencroft, the patriarch of the family. He described in disturbing detail how he had become involved with a dark sect, promising to sacrifice his own daughter in exchange for power and immortality. As she delved deeper into the mansion's secrets, the line between reality and fiction began to blur for Emily. She spent sleepless nights writing frantically, mixing her story with the horrors she discovered. The walls seemed to pulsate with a life of their own, and she swore she could see shadows moving in the corner of her eyes. The locals noticed the change in her behavior. Emily rarely went out, and when she did, she mumbled incoherently about voices and buried secrets. Her eyes, once bright and curious, were now deep and haunted. Concerned, they tried to intervene, but she pushed them away, insisting that she had to finish her book. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling. "They need me to tell their story. It's the only way to free them." One night, while writing furiously in her room, Emily heard a high-pitched scream coming from downstairs. She rushed downstairs, only to find the library completely overturned. Books were scattered all over the floor, and the curtains were swaying violently, although there was no wind. In the center of the room, an ethereal figure hovered a few inches above the floor. It was Elizabeth Ravencroft, her face contorted in an expression of pain and anger. "You know the truth now," whispered the apparition. "You need to complete the story." Emily worked tirelessly for the next few days, barely stopping to eat or sleep. The voices were now a constant cacophony, pleading, demanding that she write faster. The mansion seemed to vibrate with a supernatural energy, the shadows dancing on the walls like eager spectators. On the last night of her stay, Emily finally completed the manuscript. Exhausted and on the verge of madness, she heard the voices one last time. "You have told our story. Now, join us." An icy wind swept through the room, blowing out the candles. Emily felt invisible hands pulling her into the shadows. She screamed, but there was no one to hear her in the isolated mansion. When the police arrived to investigate her disappearance days later, they found only the manuscript. The last few pages detailed the horrors of Ravencroft Manor with disturbing precision, mixing historical facts with what appeared to be the fevered ravings of a disturbed mind. Emily's manuscript, entitled Whispers in the Shadows, was published posthumously and became an instant success. Readers and critics were fascinated by the mixture of gothic horror and seemingly autobiographical elements. Many wondered where fiction ended and reality began. Theories about Emily Blackwood's fate proliferated. Some believed that she had simply gone mad and run away. Others insisted that she had discovered too many secrets and had been silenced. And there were those who swore that, on nights with a full moon, they could see a solitary figure in the window of the room where Emily had written her last chapter. Ravencroft Manor remained empty for years, its sinister reputation amplified by Emily's story. Eventually, it was turned into a tourist attraction, with guided tours exploring the haunted places mentioned in the book. But the tour guides always avoid certain rooms after dark. They say that if you listen carefully in the dark corridors, you can hear the soft sound of a pen scratching on paper, accompanied by the urgent whispers of long, silenced voices. 6. The House of Lost Time. On the outskirts of Edinburgh, Scotland, the Mackenzie family found what seemed like the perfect home. The Victorian property, with its Gothic towers and lush gardens, was a dream come true for Sarah and Ian, along with their 10-year-old twin children, Aidan and Fiona. The surprisingly low price should have been the first warning sign, but the family's enthusiasm overshadowed any suspicions. On the day of the move, a dense fog enveloped the property. As they unloaded the truck, Sarah noticed that her wristwatch had stopped. It must be the humidity, she thought to herself. The first few days in the house were idyllic. The children explored the many rooms, discovering secret passages and hidden corners. Sarah and Ian were busy organizing the move and hardly noticed how the hours seemed to stretch out. It was on the first night of the full moon that things started to get strange. Sarah woke up in the middle of the night, feeling disoriented. The room was bathed in an unnatural silver light, and she could swear that the shadows on the walls moved of their own accord. The next morning, Ian tried to call work, but his cell phone wouldn't work. When he finally managed to use the house landline, his boss looked confused. "Ian, where have you been? You haven't shown up for a week." Perplexed, Ian argued that they had only moved in 2 days ago, but when he looked at the calendar on the kitchen wall, he realized with horror that a whole week had passed without them noticing. The time anomalies only got worse. Aidan and Fiona seemed to grow by leaps and bounds. Clothes that fit perfectly one day were too small the next. Sarah found an old diary in the attic and began to record the strange events, noticing how the days inside the house seemed to stretch on endlessly while the outside world advanced at an accelerated pace. Attempts to leave the property proved fruitless. Every time they reached the entrance gates, an invisible force pushed them back. It was as if the house held them prisoner in their own temporal bubble. With the passage of time, or was it the lack of it, the family began to change. Ian, once a jovial man, became taciturn and obsessive, spending hours studying the mechanisms of the antique clocks scattered around the house. Sarah immersed herself in occult books found in the library, desperately seeking an explanation for her situation. Aidan and Fiona, now teenagers, developed an almost telepathic connection, often finishing each other's sentences or appearing in places in the house simultaneously, even when they had been separated moments before. One night, during another full moon, Sarah made a shocking discovery. In the final pages of the diary she had found, there were accounts of previous families trapped in the same situation. The house apparently existed in a time vortex, feeding off the vital energy of its occupants to maintain its existence outside of normal time. Determined to escape, the Mackenzies devised a plan. Sarah had discovered an ancient ritual that promised to anchor the house back into the normal flow of time, but it required a significant sacrifice. On the chosen night, the family gathered in the main room. Black candles were lit, forming a circle. Ian, aged beyond his years, began to recite the words of the ritual. The walls of the house began to shake, and a supernatural wind swept through the rooms. Aidan and Fiona, holding hands, entered the circle. "It's the only way," they said in unison. "Our youth for the time stolen." Before Sarah and Ian could protest, an intense light enveloped the twins. When it dissipated, where there had once been 2 teenagers, there was now an elderly couple, their hands still intertwined. The house let out an agonizing scream that reverberated throughout the structure. The windows shattered and the walls began to crumble. The family ran outside, crossing the gates for the first time in years. Outside, the world had changed dramatically. Futuristic cars sped down the road, and the city in the distance looked like something out of a science fiction movie. For the rest of the world, decades had passed. Sarah and Ian, now with grey hair, hugged their now elderly children. Tears streamed down their wrinkled faces as they watched the house crumble behind them, taking with it the stolen years of their lives. In the days that followed, the family struggled to adapt to the new world they found themselves in. The story of the House of Lost Time became an urban legend, with curious people and paranormal hunters visiting the ruins in search of answers. But for the Mackenzies, the scars of lost time remained. Every night, they gathered for dinner, 4 generations compressed into 2 pairs of bodies, sharing memories of a life that lasted years and only a moment. And sometimes, on full moon nights, they would swear they heard the distant ticking of phantom clocks, a grim reminder of the price they paid for the time they never had. 7. The Attic of Memories. In the small town of Millbrook, Connecticut, James Sullivan inherited the old Victorian house from his grandmother, Margaret. At 35, James barely remembered his childhood visits to the estate, having spent most of his adult life in New York. The inheritance came as a surprise. He and his grandmother were not close, and his memories of her were vague and hazy. On arriving at the house, James was greeted by an imposing but decaying structure. The paint was peeling, the windows were fogged up, and the garden was overgrown with weeds. Inside, the smell of mold and antiquity was oppressive. Furniture covered in white sheets seemed like silent ghosts in the dark rooms. Determined to clean up and possibly sell the property, James began to methodically explore each room. It was when he reached the attic that things began to change. The ladder creaked ominously under his feet as he climbed, and dust danced in the dim light coming through the small windows in the roof. The attic was full of boxes, old trunks, and objects covered in cloths. James began to rummage through them, finding old photos, dusty clothes, and seemingly worthless trinkets. Then his fingers touched something cold and metallic at the bottom of a box. He pulled it out, and his heart almost stopped. It was a small silver music box. As soon as he saw it, a wave of nausea hit him, accompanied by flashes of memory, the soft sound of the melody, the smell of lavender, and an overwhelming feeling of fear. With trembling hands, James opened the box. The familiar melody began to play, and with it came the memories. He found himself a child again, hiding in a dark cupboard, the sound of the music box coming from the other side of the door, mixed with muffled voices and distant screams. Stunned, James dropped the box. The sound stopped, but the memories continued to flow. He remembered visits to his grandmother's house, strange rituals performed in the basement, missing children in the neighborhood. Determined to discover the truth, James continued his frantic search of the attic. Every object he touched seemed to trigger more memories. An old spell book revealed images of his grandmother leading a circle of hooded figures. A rag doll brought up the terrified face of a girl he had once known but never seen again. Hours passed as James delved deeper into his family's dark past. He discovered diaries detailing macabre rituals, photos of missing children, and even small bones hidden in a locked box. As night fell, James realized with horror that he was no longer alone in the attic. Shadows seemed to move in the corners, and whispers echoed off the walls. He tried to run, but the attic door closed on its own, locking him in. Trapped and terrified, James was forced to face the full truth of his family legacy. His grandmother, Margaret, had been the leader of a cult that sacrificed children in search of power and immortality. James, as a grandson, should have been the heir to this dark legacy, but something had gone wrong. Memories of his own desperate escape as a child flooded his mind. He had escaped, but at the cost of repressing all the memories of the horror he had witnessed. Now, years later, the past had caught up with him. The shadows in the attic took shape, revealing themselves as the spirits of the sacrificed children. They surrounded him, their voices a mixture of accusation and pleading. "You escaped," they whispered, "but you abandoned us. Now, you must finish what you started." James screamed, begging for forgiveness, swearing he didn't know. But the spirits were relentless. They dragged him to the center of the attic, where a ritual circle had been drawn on the floor, invisible under years of dust. As the music box played its sinister melody, James felt his consciousness fragment. Part of him wanted to resist, to fight against the fate his grandmother had planned for him. But another part, a part that had been dormant for decades, embraced the dark power coursing through his veins. The next morning, the neighbors noticed that the lights in the Sullivans' old house were on. For the first time in years, smoke was coming out of the chimney. James was seen in the garden, pruning the long-dead rose bushes, a serene smile on his face. In the weeks that followed, children from the neighborhood began to disappear again. The police investigated, but never found any clues. James, now a respected member of the community, offered his help in the search, his concerns seemingly genuine. At night, alone in his ancestral home, James would go down to the basement, where the ritual circle awaited. The music box played softly, drowning out the screams. And in the attic, the spirits of the lost children watched in silence, knowing that their numbers would soon increase. The Sullivan house once again held dark secrets behind its respectable facade, and James, consumed by his grandmother's legacy, continued a macabre tradition that had slept for a generation but never truly died. What's up, guys? We've come to the end of our 7 haunted house stories. What did you think? Which one was the scariest for you? Let us know in the comments. If you liked the video, don't forget to leave that naughty like and subscribe to the channel. It helps a lot. See you in the next video. If we survive, of course. See you.